the second video in the series, we've got a lot of topics to cover, so let's jump right in. Event handling. So event handling is what happens in the UI and the DOM when interaction is going about by the user. So here is the W3 Schools website. Here's a bunch of events that you could register for and handle. Clicking on something, there's changing a value like on a text box or a select drop down. There's even things like focus, entering the control. So let's look at the code example. So this is the same app.js function and functional component. So here's the typical return. This time we're going to return a div that has two UI controls in it. Well, it's got actually the header as well, and a couple headers. But the button is going to be interacted with. So on a click of the button, we're going to go to a function called handle click. And on the select change, we're going to do this handle change. So what else is going on? So we have the useState hook that we can use to default a value to 0 for count. And then we surface a function setCount that we can change. So in the click, we basically can use the capability of getting the current state, which is available anytime you call this function. It's available for you. So current state plus 1. So current state starts out at 0, then we increment it each click. The set select value. So what happens here is there's two values, 1 and 2. Now, also available in these an event object. So there's lots of different properties on that. One of them happens to be target and value. So depending on what's selected, we'll get one of these two. So now if we go to run that, we can see the button, we can click it, and it updates in real time, and we can select value 1, select value 2. So that's how it works. I made just a minor modification here just to illustrate another point, because you don't always just have, well, you never do just have one single functional component, right? There's a hierarchy of components. So in this example, we have my button, which is a subcomponent of the app. So app is going to use my button, and it passes some properties into it. Now, interestingly enough, we can actually pass in the click handler. So the click handler is going to stay in the app functional component, which is handle click. However, when we instantiate my button, we're going to also add my click handler here as part of the properties that gets passed in. So now the on click goes straight to props my click handler. Now, if we go look at the UI, we can see it works just the same. So we've been looking at one component containing another. There's a special syntax also for containment that has a property on the props called children. So if we look at our example here, this doesn't have it, but I'm going to progress to that. So here's a slight change. We used to have the text here that said click it. This time I'm going to pass in my button text, and then I'm going to use that as a property. So it says click it. Now if we go back here, we see that that's what it says. Now let's make a change to use this special children property. So here's the change we're going to make. So we're going to have a text embedded control or element, and that is inside button. So if we want to use it, we just say, props.children, and we can get that. So we can delete that. And now we'll see that click it is still going to be shown. Now, just to make sure that you understand that this is actually doing something. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that I don't have to restart the React app running. It's still running. And any changes I make are reflected there. So change it to 3, save it. That's kind of handy. So anyway, you can see that in this case we've got special syntax for getting children. Not necessarily to do that, but necessary to do that all the time, but just wanted to show that alternate syntax just in case you come across it at any point. Let's talk about HTML forms. Here's a simple form for somebody to enter their name and click submit. There could be a lot more, UI elements in here, checkboxes, drop downs, all kinds of controls to collect information. At that point, when the submit button is clicked, perhaps it would send the data to the back end and then store it into the database. So here's the code to do that. Nothing unusual here. So here's a form element, a form tag. And inside that, we can have our UI elements, such as the title here, the input, and the button to submit. So the way this works is you can, again, use the HTML events. So here is an event for handling the change of the input. So as I type characters into that input element, I get to see them show up right here and handle change. So I get an event, and I can look at event.target.value, and I can use my hook to set that into this local variable value. So all of this JavaScript and React code, you can see it's all working together to manage this form and have it work. So finally, when the person's ready to submit, they want to click that submit button, and here's where we have an onSubmit event handler. So in that code, we're just going to put up an alert and say what the value was at that point. Now I did something just for fun, just to illustrate what can happen here when you click and enter key values. Each time you actually have a key press, the handle change gets called. So here we can look at the event, and then we can look at the target, look at the value, and it's A. And then we can continue on. Now if I click B, you can see we hit our breakpoint again. So that's just something to be aware of. All right, now let's actually enter my name. And then if I click submit, you can see that it has that value according to what the code was set up to display, captured by the event. Something that every website or mobile app needs is navigation. So typically you'll see some kind of menu drop down along the top, along the side, or the bottom of a website or a mobile app. React doesn't actually have anything built into its framework to do this. You could have, of course, build it from scratch and put anchor tags in there and link and whatnot. However, a better option is to use an NPM package. Now I haven't shown this before, but here's the site, npmjs.com. So this is the site you can go to look at different packages you can download. Now packages are of different kinds. Some are actually scripts or executables that you download and you can run. Others are components that you can actually include into a React application as JavaScript, or some kind of Node JS application JavaScript package that you can include in your code. In our case, we're going to use this component called React Router DOM, and this will install into our local package.json and node modules directory that we can then get at. So here's the documentation on how to use it. Here's how you would install it. So just npm install -- save just means save it to your development location in your package.json. So if we run that, it's pretty quick, installs it. Now if we look at package.json, we can see that it was added right here. As I was saying then, in case I didn't explain it before, this package.json has dependencies, and so these are developer dependencies. You can also have a section, which I don't have in here, which are just test dependencies. So when you do an actual production build, it will only include the developer dependencies. The other thing I didn't really show before was that any JavaScript technology such as React or Node has this node modules directory. Don't ever delete that or mess with that. That is completely populated according to what's in your package.json. So because we just installed React Router DOM, if we were to do the, look for it, we could find React Router DOM in here. There it is right there. And we could see all the JavaScript and code that actually makes that work and run. Here's about the simplest navigation sample I can show you. We have a home page and an about page. So I can click back and forth between those. And the code to do that is rather simple with the use of React Router DOM. One thing I want to say before we go through what this code does is that React Router DOM can be used in your client-side SPA, so it's actually just running on your browser and it's managing all the routing there. It never goes to your back end. So when you change to a different page, it's not like you're re-rendering another page from the server. All those pages are on the client side and you're jumping from page to page. Now there's also a way that you can do server-side rendering. If you do want to render new pages on each, that will not be a topic for this discussion right now. So the first thing we look at is there's this hash router component that's provided from React Router DOM. There are two different ones you could use. One's hash router, which is hash-based routing, and the other one is browser router. And so that browse router allows you to have history if that's important to you. So let's take a look at how this is implemented. So this is basically the wrapper around the other components that you're going to use. So first of all, let's take a look at the pages that we're, fake pages that we're actually going to pretend we're rendering. So here's the home page and about page. It's just a div with a header. And then we actually have this other page not found. We'll see where that comes into play later, but that's for any other navigation that they do by hand outside that we can't control. This will put up a 404 page not found. So here inside the hash router, we have a component called navlink. So this right here, the navlink, that's the UI anchors that you see that you can click on. You don't need to have those, but obviously you do if you want people to click on it. The routes are the paths that you could actually type into the browser to go to. So if you didn't have the UI, you could type in the routes. But you can see how the two work together. So we have to put the routes in place that we can go to. We have a location for our home page, which is the slash. And if we do slash about, that will take us to our about page. So this basically says right here, the to is where we go to if they click on this. So this is the text that shows, and if you click on this nav link, it will take you to the slash route, which then are referred to down here. So the slash routes then say what elements to render or what pages to render. So these can be as complicated as you want, and then these would be separate files, for example, that you would bring in for each of the pages that you want to render. So here's a route that takes us to home. Just if you go to slash about takes us to about, and then here's the 404. And this actually is how this works. So there's a path for 404. We could actually enter that. Otherwise, anything, whatever else it is that doesn't match one of these will then be routed to 404. Okay, so let's demonstrate that. We could, like I said, type about, and we could route directly to about. We could try to go to blah, and it would take us to the 404 page not found. Let's talk about another case where React doesn't really provide you the capability, but it's easy to get, and that is, how do I create a responsive web application? And I demonstrated this before, that if you have a window that you want to then make smaller or larger or put on a mobile device, then if it's reactive, it can resize itself to the proper size. So to do that, there are several different frameworks available. So there's one called Bootstrap that was created by Twitter. Another standard that was put forth is by Google called Material Design. That's just a general design framework that they created, and implementations of it exist. So there's one for React called Material UI. We're going to demonstrate Bootstrap. So to get started with Bootstrap, we need to do the same install npm similar to what we did before. And this will install the components that we need. And then we can go put those into our code. The first change that we need to do is to pull in the CSS. All of this is run off of CSS that gets imported into our application so that then we can use that to style the components like buttons and whatnot. So here's the change we made to the app. So we import, there's lots of different controls, and we'll take a look at some of those in a second, but the basic point here is that there's this npm package React Bootstrap. We import a button, and then we basically instantiate that button in the return of the HTML that we want to have exposed. So this is a React component that they've built that is specially styled and controlled. We can set the style of it, the size. In this case, we're going to have, if we click on the button, it's going to take us to actually the React Bootstrap site. So let's go to the app running. You can see that we had the text, view React Bootstrap docs, and so that shows up on the button. And you can see it's styled differently than the button we saw before, if you remember the click it example. So we can click it, and then it does its action, which happens to be take us to this React Bootstrap site. Now, here's the thing, right? So not only is Bootstrap very reactive in that you can resize all the components and they move around, as we showed with the Newswatcher site. So that's great, right? It's reactive. But the basic point is you get all these really great components that they don't come with React, right? It just has the basic ability to surface whatever you want HTML-wise. So this is like a UI component library. So if you look at Material and Bootstrap, they're very similar. Some offer, more components or different components than others. So let's say, for example, that you wanted to have a table. So here's the ability to use the Bootstrap table component. There's also layouts so that you could manage the layout. So there's specific syntax to do that. How about a carousel control, right? How would you like to have to create one of these? Well, you don't with Bootstrap or Material. They've got these built in. So the code here, they give you plenty of examples of how to do the code. So you can put together a more capable UI, not just a reactive UI, but all these components you're now able to take advantage of. Here's a spinner control. So if you want to do some kind of spinner animation while something is happening in the UI, rendering or whatever, you can take use of that. So definitely very valuable Material or React to pull into your JavaScript React application. I can now dive into a very important topic, that is, how do I make HTTP REST requests from my browser SPA application from React code? Well, the nice thing is React code is just JavaScript code running in the browser, so you can take advantage of any of the available JavaScript functionality that's already there. There happens to be a function call called fetch. We'll take a look at that in a second. So let's first take a look at what we're going to query for and what we're going to display. So someone put up this website just to test out JSON. And if you go to this location, there's to-dos, and you can look at like to-do number 3, to-do number 4, basically return some JSON back. And these are the different fields, the keys and values. So there's a key called title, and here is the title for to-do item number 3. So if we put this into an application, we can see we can go back and forth between the different titles that get returned from the JSON. So how do we do that in code? Let's take a look at that now. So we borrowed some of the code we had been using before. That is a select control. So this is the drop down. So the drop down has 1, 2, and 3. I don't know how many to-dos are actually on that site to get, but we'll just get 3. So depending on the selection, we can jump to a different request to get that data and then show it. So we saw the use of hooks before, and there was a use state hook. Now we're going to look at a new hook called use effect. So first off, the use state. So we have to-do number and we have the title. So to-do number starts out at 1, and it can go 1, 2, or 3. And then the title is basically we'll set that with the set title function call later in some code. So here's what the use effect looks like. So it's a function that you provide that can run whatever you want it to run. In our case, we want it to run a fetch call. So this is the JavaScript fetch available in the browser, in the SDK, and we're going to actually make use of that to call to this JSON placeholder, just as we saw. And this is a string template. So if you know anything about JavaScript string templates, you can just put your regular characters in there. But if you put $curly brace, that represents I want some JavaScript. So whatever's inside that, I want it to be replaced. So we're going to go to this path, and inside that path we're going to go to /to-do number. It starts out at 1. So when we first load the page, we'll actually go to this use effect, call fetch. This will then use a promise. So this is JavaScript promise notation, and we can get the JSON from it. We happen to throw errors if there's something wrong. There won't be. But here's that set title call. So as we saw in the JSON, let's go to that. It had a key name title. So that's what we're going to pull out of the JSON response. And then we can see that the UI will get refreshed and updated. Now here's some interesting syntax also that's part of the use effect. If this was blank, basically this use effect would run one time only upon initial rendering of this page. If you put any kind of local state variable in there, anytime that is detected as being changed, then it runs this use effect again. So you would be able to potentially have multiple use effects in this code, and as different things were changing, they could go to different fetches and get different data to populate. So you may have lots of different data that you're pulling from different locations and sites to get your UI populated. So that's basically how you use the use effect and how you make function calls back to your backend HTTP API, either yours that you've exposed or some other third-party service. Well, that brings us to the end of part 2 of 3. We've got some basic understanding now with some little snippets here and there. Part 3 then is going to really pull it all together into a complete application called Newswatcher. And here's the topology diagram we'll go over in part 3. We'll talk about how it's hosted in AWS, and we'll really see, more of a complete overview. Like we went over React Router, DOM. We went over, how that navigation works and how we use forms and all that. But all of that is put together in a much larger application that's more comprehensive, and it's on GitHub so that you can access the code. But part 3 will completely dive into that and give you a look at how to build a more comprehensive application instead of just the little snippets that we've presented up to this point. Don't forget about the book that this is all based on. If you're liking the videos here, I advise you to get the book, which has a lot more details, a lot more coverage, and really pulls it together across the 3 tiers of the application: the presentation layer, the service layer, and the backend database layer.